Have you ever been judged by someone based on their appearance because they thought you couldn't be the person you were trying to be that morning? At Chicago O'Hare International Airport, a 15-year-old black girl named Nicole Williams walked through the bustling crowd. On her shoulders was a pilot's uniform with 4 yellow stripes, a symbol of command. But instead of respect, she received a skeptical look and a sarcastic smile from Thomas Richardson, a flight attendant with 18 years of experience. Nice costume, sweetheart. Halloween isn't for another 7 months. Just one sentence, and the air seemed to freeze. If it were you, among hundreds of skeptical eyes, what would you do? Explain, get angry, or just stay silent and let time tell? Nicole chose the third option. Little did she know that just a few hours later, the man who had just despised her would be begging her to save the flight in the middle of a raging storm. A story of dignity, prejudice, and silent justice is about to begin. If you believe that true power lies in common wisdom, please like, share, and subscribe, and follow along with Chief Pilot Nicole Williams' extraordinary journey. The morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was thick with fog and the smell of roasting coffee. People were bustling about as usual, their footsteps pounding on the polished tiles in sync with the flight announcements. Amid all the commotion, Nicole Williams, a 15-year-old black girl, walked slowly. Her pilot's uniform with 4 yellow stripes on the shoulders seemed a little too big for her petite frame. But her eyes were not steady, alert, with the air of someone used to proving her abilities. In the crew inspection area, Thomas Richardson, a veteran flight attendant with 18 years of experience, was checking employee badges. The white man was in his 40s. His hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes had the tired, yet arrogant look of someone who had experienced a lot. When he saw Nicole approaching, he raised his eyebrows and smiled faintly. Nice costume? Sweetheart. Halloween isn't for another 7 months. The atmosphere suddenly became quiet. Nicole stopped, showed her Skyway Airlines pilot card, and said calmly, Nicole Williams, Chief Pilot, Flight 447. Thomas laughed, a dry laugh that held a hint of contempt. Chief Pilot, at 15. Sure, diversity hire, I guess. Nicole didn't reply. She just nodded, took the card, and walked away. It was a small gesture, but the way she turned slow, precise, decisive, made Thomas hesitate for a moment. But his professional pride made him brush it off as if nothing had happened. Nicole paused at the window overlooking the runway. The steel birds trailed in the gray sky. She opened the small notebook in her hand. It was crammed with notes about wind currents, cloud levels, and pressure. The weather forecast for Chicago-Atlanta was bad shear. Strong thunderstorms, low-level turbulence. She made a few notes. Nicole glanced up at the sky, a moment of silence that few people noticed. She touched her captain's cap, a habit she had when she thought of her father, or Robert Williams, a former Navy pilot who had died in a car crash. People won't always respect you, Nicole, her father once told her, but if you keep your cool, you'll make them listen. That saying became a guiding principle. In the first-class cabin of Flight 447, passengers were already settling into their seats. Thomas, with his experienced demeanor, went to check the seats. When he saw Nicole sitting near the window, still in uniform, he couldn't help but tease her further. So, sweetheart, going to flight camp. Nicole looked up, her voice calm. I'm presenting turbulence management protocols. The answer made several passengers turn. An elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret Michael, frowned slightly at Thomas. A black man in a suit, Derek Johnson, watched with a cold gaze. Nicole, however, did not appear angry. She simply smiled, as if she had just heard an old story she was all too familiar with. Thomas cleared his throat, avoided everyone's gaze, and left. But in that moment, he didn't know that he had just lost something more important, the respect of the very people looking at him. When the fasten seatbelt sign came on, Nicole looked up. Outside the window, the sky had darkened. The clouds were thick. The thunder rumbled. She recognized the familiar signs of wind shear, the dreaded enemy of every pilot. She jotted down some readings in her notebook. Inside the cockpit, Captain James Mitchell, 55, felt a slight tightness in his chest. First Officer David Jenkins, 26, looked worried. Nicole glanced at her watch, calculating her ideal altitude. In her head, the numbers and wind direction moved like a familiar song. But in the back compartment, Thomas laughed and joked with the passengers. Completely unaware of the tension that was rising by the minute, the plane shook slightly. A few murmurs were heard. Nicole calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. "Thomas, can you contact the cockpit for me? There are signs of wind shear at 30,000 feet. Thomas raised an eyebrow, the sarcasm returning. "You sure, sweetheart? Maybe just nerves." Nicole did not reply. She looked straight into his eyes, her voice low but hard as steel. "I'm sure. Please, do it now." Something in her gaze made him pause, if only for a second. But before he could react, the plane shook harder. A metallic screech. Lights flashed. The whole cabin rocked. A passenger screamed. Oxygen masks fell. And in the cockpit, Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. Weak and urgent. "Medical emergency. Need assistance. Anyone qualified. Send help." Thomas was stunned. Rebecca Martinez, another flight attendant, immediately ran over. Nicole was already standing there, her voice firm. "I'm Chief Pilot, Nicole Williams. Let me through." Rebecca looked at her ID, 4 yellow stripes, her name clearly printed. She nodded. Thomas, suddenly feeling small, tried to reach out to stop him, but then let go. Nicole turned back and said only one sentence, cold and clear. "Either help me save these people, or get out of my way." No one said anything more. The cabin was dead silent, except for the roar of the engine and the pounding of our hearts. Nicole walked quickly toward the cockpit. The door opened, the blue light from the dashboard illuminating her face, young, calm, and determined, like someone born to sit there. There are rough skies ahead, but for Nicole, that's no longer a fear. It's the only place she feels safe in the midst of the storm, where justice needs no words. Only truth takes flight. The cockpit door closed behind Nicole Williams, the blue light of the control panel reflecting on her face like a light of responsibility and destiny. But before all that happened in the sky, that morning where it all began was still fresh in the memory of those at Chicago O'Hare, like a warning frame before a great storm of prejudice and justice. That Tuesday morning, Chicago O'Hare was thick with fog. The ground was wet from the night rain, reflecting the pale yellow lights of the airport. People were hurrying, dragging suitcases, talking on the phone, sipping steaming black coffee. In the hustle and bustle, only one person walked slowly. The girl was Nicole Williams, 15 years old, tall and slim, with a face younger than her years. Her hair pulled back into a bun under her captain's cap that was slightly askew. Her Skyway Airlines pilot's uniform seemed too formal for her teenage appearance. But no one could deny the way she walked, the way she straightened her back and looked straight ahead. She had the air of someone who knew her place in the world. She doesn't need to act confident. She is confident. Each of her footsteps echoed softly on the shiny tiled floor. The sound of her shoes was not too loud, but enough to make people turn to look. In her hand was a small silver suitcase with a pilot's badge on it, which read N. Williams, Chief Pilot, Skyway Airlines. A security guard saw her badge and nodded. Nicole returned a polite but distant smile, because she knew smiles weren't always returned with respect, especially when the person smiling was a black woman in a pilot's uniform. In the distance, Thomas Richardson stood at the crew security gate, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, watching her approach. The 42-year-old had worked for Skyway for nearly 2 decades. He had been a shining light on the flight attendant team, but the changes at the airline diversity hiring, promotions of young people, people of color, women had left him feeling left behind. He didn't hate anyone. He just didn't believe that a child, and a black one at that, could really be a pilot. What he called experience had become an invisible net that tightened his mind. As Nicole approached, Thomas curled his lips and said something he would regret for the rest of his life. Niece costume, sweetheart. Halloween isn't for another 7 months. Nicole stopped, not frowning, not reacting. She just looked at him, her gaze straight, calm as an autumn lake. She opened her bag, took out her employee card, her voice clear and precise as if she was making an announcement in the cabin. Nicole Williams, Chief Pilot, Flight 447. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. Chief Pilot. Of what? Your high school paper plane club. No one laughed. A colleague standing nearby looked embarrassed, avoiding Nicole's gaze. She took the card back and said only one sentence. Good morning, Mr. Richardson. Then she walked past, no protest, no anger, but Thomas felt the air around him grow heavy. Nicole stopped by the window overlooking the runway. White planes lined up, fog swirling around their wings. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and opened it to a new page flight maps, wind readings, and notes scribbled in her own hand, her own. Having flown her first plane at age 10, fountain pen glides on paper. Expected wind shear along ATL route. Prepare alternate route FL 370. Beside her, an old pilot passed by, glanced and smiled. Are you preparing for Flight 447? I heard the new chief pilot is very young. Nicole looked up, her eyes gentle. Yes, I heard that. The other pilot nodded and walked away, not knowing he had just spoken to that person. In the crew lounge, chatter about the weather was rumbling. Staff discussed schedules, checked uniforms, and prepared to board. Nicole sat in the corner, quietly reading a technical report. She spoke little, only smiling occasionally when someone passed by to say hello. Outside the window, rain began to fall. Droplets of water rolled down the glass, reflecting the gray sky. She touched it lightly with her finger, thinking of her father, Robert Williams, who had taught her in the sky. You cannot win by emotions. You can only win by discipline. Nicole closed the notebook and took a deep breath. She knew she was about to fly into the thick clouds, where justice was not in words, but in actions. A few rows back, Thomas was still reeling from the encounter. He muttered something between annoyance and apology. Every company wants to show off these days. A 15-year-old chief pilot. How ridiculous. But deep down, something was unsettling him. The way Nicole looked at him, no challenge, no fear, just still, as if she had seen too many like him before. When the announcement for Flight 447 was announced, Nicole stood up. She picked up her suitcase and walked slowly but surely, each step having its own rhythm. The people in the waiting room watched, some surprised, some smiling. A young staff member whispered to her friend, "Who is that girl?" She looks like she came out of a movie. No one answered, because no one knew they had just seen a piece of aviation history. The youngest chief pilot ever given command of a domestic commercial flight. Nicole walked through the gate. Thomas was standing in front of the cabin door again. He was silent, avoiding her eyes. There was no more joking. She just nodded and walked in. No words. No need for proof. The air in the cabin was as thick as the clouds outside. Nicole put down her bag and sat down on the window seat. She opened her notebook and wrote one last line before the plane took off. You don't have to shout to be heard. Just fly high enough to drown out all the noise. The morning rain in Chicago O'Hare had not yet completely cleared. The droplets on the glass reflected the blue-white lights, flickering like the breathing of a city that never sleeps. Nicole sat still at the departure gate, her eyes following the Boeing 737 Skyway Flight 447 waiting for her on the runway. Little did she know, just a few minutes later, that very flight would become the biggest test of her life, not of flying skills, but of human dignity in the face of prejudice. Thomas Richardson stood at the crew counter, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. The 42-year-old had a weathered face and slightly cloudy eyes, the marks of years of flying thousands of flights without ever being promoted. In his 18 years in the business, Thomas had seen many young people surpass him. Some had connections. Others had a diversity policy that he had always considered a formality. He told himself that it didn't take talent to get ahead, just the right skin color or gender at the right time. That bitterness seeped into his voice, his gaze, and the way he treated others. As Nicole approached, the first thing Thomas saw was her pilot's uniform with 4 yellow stripes, the sign of the highest rank in the crew. But then his eyes slid down to her face. A black girl, no older than 15 or 16, brown skin, bright eyes, petite. The uniform looked out of place on her. Thomas chuckled softly, his voice carrying a tone of sarcasm, mixed with the pride of a man too used to being under the authority of others. Nice costume, sweetheart. Halloween isn't for another 7 months. The words were said lightly, but enough to tear the air around the ID check counter. Nicole looked up. The dim light fell on her face, creating a soft outline around her eyes. She didn't react, didn't argue. She just opened her bag, took out her Skyway Airlines employee card, and spoke in a calm, concise, yet coldly standard voice. Nicole Williams, Chief Pilot, Flight 44B7. Thomas narrowed his eyes, as if she had just said something absurd. Chief Pilot. That's cute. You kids really dream big these days. Nicole held her card up to the scanner. A green light flashed, and the system read, Valid. Chief Pilot access. Approved. Thomas stood still, taking it in for a few seconds. He laughed, but it wasn't funny anymore. Let me guess diversity hire. Huh. Skyway really wants the headlines. The atmosphere was tense. Another employee who was sorting through documents suddenly stopped and glanced at Thomas. Nicole remained silent. She just looked at him calmly, not angry, not pitying, not contemptuous, just still. The look bothered Thomas more than the arguing. He felt exposed, naked, with nowhere to hide his true feelings. Nicole walked through the security gate, leaving Thomas standing there. The man pursed his lips, telling himself that the girl must be uplifted, that the world was easy on people of color. But inside, there was something strange a doubt, mixed with shame. On the way to the plane, Nicole stopped by the window, looking at the darkening sky. The thick clouds were like layers of pent-up emotions. She opened her notebook and wrote a few lines. Weather moderate turbulence. Possible wind shear. Maintain altitude 37,000 IGSF. She always took notes by hand, a habit her father had taught her. Computers can calculate faster, but your heart knows when to trust experience. Nicole smiled slightly. Not everyone saw her as a pilot. Many only saw her color, her age, her gender. But she had learned to live with that, not with anger, but with accomplishment. Thomas followed, still muttering, 15, chief pilot. What a joke. A young flight attendant heard and whispered, she really is chief pilot. Thomas, I saw her name on the list yesterday. Thomas paused. No way. She looks like a high school student. Must be some kind of prodigy. They say she got her business license when she was 14. Thomas was silent. The story made him feel both backward and embarrassed. He was not ready to accept that the world had changed, that wisdom could overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the people he despised were the ones who would decide his fate. Nicole boarded the plane first. She greeted the crew, her voice soft and full of the professionalism of an adult. Good morning, everyone. I'll be on board for Flight 447. Thomas walked by, heard, but pretended not to notice. He opened the trunk, adjusted the passenger seat, and buckled the seatbelt. But inside, the discomfort did not subside. In his head, an old voice rang out, the voice of the manager who had told him during last year's review, Richardson, "You're good at your job, but you lack adaptability. The company needs people who can evolve." He hated that word, evolve. To him, it meant to make room for someone else. Nicole sat in the front compartment, near the window. The morning light fell on her face, reflecting off her calm eyes. She didn't look at anyone, just opened her notebook again. On the first page, her father's old handwriting was still there. Courage isn't loud. Nicole, it's the calm voice that says fly anyway. She read softly. As a reminder, behind him, Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching. The young woman unsettled him. Something about her composure made him feel small. Not because she was chief pilot, but because she had no need to prove herself. Thomas thought about the times he had been criticized by his superiors, the years he had been passed over for promotions, and the anger he had built up into his habit of looking down on others. But then, when he saw Nicole's silent gaze, he felt as if he had seen a mirror staring back at him. The plane began to taxi down the runway. The sky was gray, the clouds rolling in as if to signal something ahead. Nicole closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. No one could hear her, but she was saying to herself, "It's okay. Just do what you were taught." In the cockpit, the yellow light reflected off Nicole Williams' face. She sat still, her eyes looking out at the overcast sky before takeoff. Outside, the wind blew hard, carrying with it the whine of the engines. Inside, a silence fell on her small shoulders as if all her memories were flowing back to where they began Detroit, 10 years ago. There was no sound of jet engines in Detroit in those days. There was only the hum of old cars, the distant sound of fire sirens, and the laughter of a black man in a Navy flight jacket, Robert Williams. To Nicole, her father meant the world. Every morning, he took her out onto the lawn behind their house, pointed to the sky, and said, "See, Nicole. Every flight path is a choice. You can't control the wind, but you can choose how to control your wings." She was only 6 years old at the time. She didn't fully understand the meaning of that saying, only that her father always looked at the sky as if he were looking at himself. Robert was a U.S. Navy pilot serving in the Pacific. He had made emergency landings, rescued fellow pilots from burning planes, and faced a Force 12 hurricane while maintaining a calm voice while communicating with the dispatch station. But then, after his discharge, he chose a quiet life teaching civilian pilots to children at a local aviation club. Nicole often sat in the corner of the classroom, quietly watching her father instruct others. She loved listening to him talk about airflow and watching him draw wind patterns on the board with his fingers. Once, when her father asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she replied, "I want to be a flyer, but not to escape from the ground. I want to understand why you always feel at peace up there." Robert laughed and patted his daughter's head. "When you understand that, you will no longer be afraid of falling, but life waits for no one." One winter evening, the roads were slippery, and Robert lost control of his car on the way home. The crash killed him instantly. Nicole, only 10 years old, stood silently at the funeral, not crying, just holding her father's flying cap, her eyes blankly staring at the portrait. People say she is a strong girl, but in fact, from that day on, she was no longer a child. 3 weeks after the funeral, Nicole took the hat to the aviation club. She went to see her father's instructor, Mr. Howard, who had taught Robert to fly when he was young. "I want to learn," she said. "I'm still young." "Nicole, I know. But Dad said no one asks your age when you save a life." Howard looked into those eyes, the same eyes Robert had when he was young, and he nodded. From then on, Nicole learned to fly every afternoon in an old silver Cessna, hand-powered. At first, she was so nervous she forgot how to operate it. But she persevered. At 10, she mastered the theory of aerodynamics. At 12, she flew solo for the first time alone, with no one by her side. Howard recalls that when the plane touched down, Nicole didn't scream or shout. She just opened the cockpit door, took off her helmet, and said softly, "I did it, Father." The story of the flying black girl quickly spread throughout Detroit. People came to see her as a phenomenon, a strange news. But Nicole did not like the cameras, did not like the applause. She just wanted to keep flying. At 14, she completed her commercial certification. At 15, Skyway Airlines invited her to become the youngest domestic chief pilot in the history of the U.S. airline industry. Many objected. Some said it was a PR stunt. Some said she couldn't be responsible for hundreds of lives. Nicole remained silent. She did not appear on television or give interviews. She only sent the company's board of directors a short email. "I don't need anyone to believe I can fly. I just need the chance to prove I can keep them safe." From then on, every flight became a silent prayer for her father. Nicole always wore Robert's old captain's cap before takeoff, as a private ritual. The cap was worn, the silver trim worn, but she never replaced it. She once told Rebecca, a flight attendant from the same airline, "People think I wear this hat because it's lucky. But actually, it reminds me that there are things heavier than the sky, the faith of the person who gave me wings." Rebecca said nothing, just lightly touched her shoulder. From the outside, people see Nicole as a symbol of success, of the new generation, young, talented, resilient. But inside, she is still just a little girl, still dreaming of her father every time the sky turns dark. In those dreams, Robert still said the old line, "No one needs to shout to be heard. My daughter, just fly high enough, and the wind will carry your voice far and wide." And so, when faced with Thomas Richardson's taunts at the airport this morning, Nicole didn't get angry. She'd seen worse prejudice. She'd heard people say the kids shouldn't dream too big, that black people can't be pilots. But her father had taught her your silence was their ultimate test. Back in the present, on Flight 447 waiting to take off. Nicole gently touched the small photo tucked in her pocket, a photo of her father in uniform, smiling. She looked out the window, where the sky darkened and rain began to fall. A small smile crossed her lips, almost unnoticed. "I will keep them safe, Father." The sound of rain hitting the fuselage, in the cockpit. The light from the dashboard reflected on Nicole Williams' face. She closed the small photo of her father and put it in her pocket. Outside, the sky was as gray as cold metal. The smell of fuel, the speakers, and the footsteps of the crew combined into a strange music, a sound only those who have flown can understand. Little did she know, today's flight, Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta, would be more than just a business trip. It would be the ultimate test of everything her father had taught her: calm, discipline, and the justice of silence. Nicole got up from her chair and checked her briefcase. She had been sent by her airline to attend the National Aviation Safety Conference in Atlanta, where experts discussed strategies for dealing with wind shear. Ironically, it was the phenomenon she had simulated, presented, and been praised as the child who understands wind like adults understand politics. She smiled slightly at the thought, but this morning, something made her uneasy. Nicole opened her tablet and logged on to Skyway. The weather map came up, a thick cloud band stretching from Indiana down to northern Georgia. Red dots of turbulence appeared right in Flight 447's projected path. She quickly noted in her notebook wind shear is strong in the lower troposphere, around FL 320, FL 340. Temperature, 47 deg. Backup altitude, FL 370. The pen paused for a second. She looked at the dense wind lines on the screen and felt something strange, like a premonition. Not fear, but a quiet warning. Nicole exhaled softly and said softly, "The wind is not gentle today." Rebecca, the flight attendant, walked over, clipboard in hand. "What did you say?" "Nicole?" "Oh, nothing. I just thought the weather was going to test someone today." Rebecca smiled slightly, not understanding what she meant. But there was something in Nicole's eyes that made the girl hesitate for a moment, an unusual stillness, as if Nicole heard something that others couldn't. Before boarding, Nicole stopped by the dispatch desk. A young technician handed her the latest radar update. There are a couple of cold fronts colliding in the Tennessee area. The system is advising a slight turn to the southeast, but Captain Mitchell has confirmed it will remain on track. Nothing too serious. Nicole nodded. "It's not serious. Until it becomes serious." Her words made the technician look up, slightly confused, but Nicole just smiled and put the documents back in her bag. She didn't argue. She never had to. When she reached the boarding area, the passengers were already lining up. Nicole stood back and watched. Thomas Richardson, the flight attendant she had met that morning, was guiding the passengers onto the plane. She caught his quick, cold glance at her. Then he looked away. Nicole did not blame. She just gently touched her father's captain's hat and whispered in her heart, "Respect is not something you demand. It is something others learn in time." On the way to the departure gate, the loudspeaker announced Skyway Flight 447 bound for Atlanta, now boarding. Nicole looked out the window. The rain had picked up. Little flashes of lightning flashed between the clouds, not strong enough to be frightening, but enough to signal that something was afoot. To others, it might seem like a normal thing, but to Nicole she could read the language of the sky. She knew those flashes weren't just electricity, but a sign of a changing wind. Stepping onto the gangway, she looked down the fuselage, her hand lightly touching the cold white paint. An old habit. Whenever you touch the fuselage, remember it is not inanimate metal, her father had said. It is where you have entrusted the lives of hundreds of people. It knows if your hands are shaking. Nicole smiled slightly. I'm not shaking. Dad. She sat down in first class and took off her gloves. A drop of water fell from her hair to her wrist, cold and stinging. Outside, the rain drummed steadily against the window, each sound like a warning. She opened her notebook and wrote one last line before takeoff. Weather unstable. Maintain observation. Don't trust the calm. Thomas walked past, his eyes still filled with disdain, but mixed with something else, perhaps confusion. He stopped, looked at the notebook in Nicole's hand, and asked half-jokingly, "Planning your imaginary flight again?" Nicole looked up. She didn't smile, just answered softly, her voice as light as the wind. "No. Just taking note of what's coming." Thomas smiled wryly and walked away. He didn't mind the comment, but hours later, it would haunt him forever. In the cockpit, Captain James Mitchell and First Officer David Jenkins were preparing for takeoff. They greeted the crew over the radio, their voices casual, tinged with the sound of falling rain. Nicole looked at her watch, 8:46 a.m., a morning like any other, except the sky was not willing to stay still. As the wheels left the ground, Nicole's body tilted slightly backward. From the window, she saw Chicago fading into fog. Below were the streets, the rooftops small, peaceful. Above, dark clouds rolled in like a heavy blanket. Closing in, Nicole muttered softly, "Not everyone sees the storm before it comes." A passenger sitting nearby turned and smiled. "What did you say?" "Oh, nothing. I just have a habit of watching the sky." The guest nodded, then turned away. But when Nicole looked outside, she saw the first flash of lightning, thin, bright, and very close. She knew something was coming. She closed her eyes, her hand on her captain's hat. Her father's familiar voice echoed in her head. "Don't be afraid of the storm. Nicole, just remember no one wins by reacting. The one who stays calm the longest wins." And as if in prophecy, Flight 447 continued to fly into thick clouds where justice was about to be tested by storm. The engine hummed steadily, but the atmosphere in the cabin is still heavy, as if something has not been said. Flight 447 is leaving the low clouds, heading south. The weak light coming through the window, illuminating Nicole Williams' face, making her look like a piece of calm before the storm. But in the corner of first class, there is another gaze watching, not admiration, but suspicion. That gaze belongs to Thomas Richardson, and in a few minutes, his old self will speak again. Thomas walked down the aisle, carrying a tray of orange juice and coffee. His voice was even and professional, a tone honed over thousands of flights. But as he approached the first row, where Nicole sat reading, his feet stopped. She was still wearing her pilot's uniform. Her captain's cap was perched neatly on her lap. The light reflected off the yellow stripes on her shoulders, 4 stripes, the symbol of command. And that, to Thomas, was like a silent challenge. He smiled sarcastically and spoke loudly enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "So, sweetheart, going to flight camp?" The question fell into the air, light as a joke, but full of sharpness. Nicole looked up, her eyes calm, her voice precise, neither higher nor lower than necessary. "I'm presenting turbulence management protocols at the Aviation Safety Conference." That voice, confident but not arrogant, made several passengers turn their heads. An elderly woman, Mrs. Margaret Michael, sitting in the chair opposite, frowned slightly. She adjusted her scarf, giving Thomas a disapproving look, the look of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between politeness and rudeness. Behind her, a black businessman, Derek Johnson, looked up from his laptop. He observed the scene before him with the calmness of someone accustomed to reading body language in this society. And what he read from Thomas, not curiosity, but prejudice. Thomas pretended to smile, poured juice into the glass, his voice still light, as if this conversation was harmless. Wow, impressive. Presenting. Huh, that's big for your age. Nicole didn't answer. She just looked straight ahead, her eyes neither avoiding nor confronting. She put the newspaper down on the table and folded it neatly. Her voice was low, almost as if she was talking to herself. Age doesn't decide professionalism, Mr. Richardson. Preparation does. Thomas froze. There was no insult in the statement, no anger, no sarcasm, just the truth, spoken too calmly for him to argue. He smiled faintly, trying to keep face. Sure, prepare. Then he turned away, but his voice was no longer steady. The atmosphere in first class was strange. No one spoke, but one could sense that the boundaries had been torn. Some passengers looked at Nicole with curiosity. Others, especially the older ones, looked at Thomas with a hint of disappointment. Mrs. Margaret Michael spoke softly, her voice soft but sharp as steel. Young lady, you don't owe anyone an explanation. People who fly high are often questioned by those who never left the ground. Nicole smiled and turned. Thank you, ma'am. I've learned to let the wind answer for me. Mrs. Michael chuckled. It was a simple statement, but it caused the first-class cabin to suddenly become unusually quiet, as if everyone was hearing something deeper than the words. Derek Johnson folded his laptop, tilted his head, and asked softly, You really a pilot? Yes, sir. Skyway. Chief pilot. Domestic operations. Derek raised his eyebrows, his eyes flickering with surprise before slowly turning to respect. Well, I'll be damned. Thomas heard it all. His face burned. A strange feeling crept into his chest, not exactly shame, but uncomfortable. Either. His ego was being challenged, and worse, it was being challenged publicly. He turned back, trying to regain his professional demeanor. Would you like some water? Ms. Williams. No, thank you. That was it. But it was that no. Thank you, soft, polite, and correct, that made Thomas feel as if he had been dismissed from the conversation without another word being said. The plane shook slightly. There was a ding sound, and the seatbelt sign came on. Nicole glanced out the window. The clouds were beginning to thicken, and the light was fading. She looked at her watch and made a small note in her notebook. The troposphere begins at 29,000 Tirwolf. Wind shear forming. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his work, but his eyes were no longer calm. He looked at Nicole, the girl he had despised all morning, and saw her calmly taking notes, observing, completely unfazed by the slight jolt. She looked like a real pilot. Too much. Part of him didn't want to believe it, but the other part began to whisper. What if she's right? The slight shaking turned into a stronger one. Some passengers held on to the handrails. Nicole remained calm, her eyes fixed on the window, as if reading the rhythm of the clouds. She whispered to Margaret, It's just the jet stream changing direction. We'll be fine. Thomas heard, and though he hated to admit it, her voice made him feel safe. For the first time in his 20 years as a flight attendant, he found himself wanting to believe a girl he had scoffed at moments before. Rebecca walked over and whispered to Thomas, You should ease up. Tom, she's not what you think. Yeah, what do you think she is? Someone who knows what she's doing. Rebecca finished speaking and walked away. Thomas stood still. The plane shook slightly again, as if to remind them that the sky did not distinguish between right and wrong. One mistake, and everyone paid the same price. Nicole opened the notebook and added the last line. Weather instability confirmed. Maintain composure. She closed her pen and looked out the window. The sky was darkening, as if swallowing the light. Her face appeared in the reflection on the glass calm, but her eyes seemed to know the storm was coming. Outside, the dark clouds had swallowed the light. The first-class cabin was bathed in a soft yellow light, seemingly peaceful, but beneath that calmness was something only pilots could sense, an imbalance in the wind. Nicole knew it. She had learned to listen to the sky, and now it was beginning to speak in the language of warning. Skyway Flight 447 shuddered slightly, as if someone had given it a gentle shove. Once, twice. A small bump echoed in the overhead compartment, causing several passengers to raise their heads. Nicole looked up at the ceiling, her eyes focused, not panicked, just calculating. She recognized the pattern wind shear. The shear was starting to form, around 30,000 feet. She bent down and quickly wrote a few lines in her notebook. Shear onset. Monitor vertical wind shifts. Then close. Stand up gently. Thomas Richardson walked by with a tray of coffee. Nicole said softly, Mr. Richardson, you should alert the cockpit. We may be entering wind shear. Thomas turned back, frowning, his voice tinged with mockery. Wind shear. Where did you learn that word? Sweetie, I've been in the air for 18 years. I think I'd recognize it if it was something serious. Nicole looked at him, her eyes not angry, just silent. The wind does not warn with sound. It warns with rhythm. Thomas laughed, trying not to look upset. Well, thanks for the lesson, Captain. The word captain came out heavy, not respectful, but sarcastic. She didn't answer, just gently placed her hands on the armrest, steadying herself as the plane shook again, more violently this time. A few passengers murmured softly. A young woman clasped her husband's hand, and Mrs. Margaret Michael looked up at the ceiling, then at Nicole, her gaze a sign of unspoken trust. Rebecca Martinez, a young flight attendant, hurried up from the back deck. Her face was tense, but she kept a professional smile. Tom, can you feel it? The cabin pressure is fluctuating a little. I can see it, but don't worry. The system is self-balancing. Still need to check with the cockpit. Thomas sighed. My God, is everyone a pilot today? Rebecca Key sang Nicole. Do you notice anything? Nicole nodded slightly, her voice small but firm. Wind shear. All the way south, through the low-level cumulus clouds. If we don't get altitude right, we'll hit an inversion. Rebecca was taken aback. The way Nicole spoke clear, precise, without hesitation, was unlike any passenger she'd ever encountered. Do you work in the industry? Rebecca asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Nicole opened her purse and showed her ID. Skyway Airline's chief pilot, domestic operations. Rebecca stared for a few seconds, then looked up. Her eyes were surprised for a moment, then unusually serious. Sorry, I didn't know. It's okay. The important thing is we're on the same flight. Thomas stood a few steps away, listening, but not believing. He laughed dryly. Fake ID. I've seen stuff like this before. Rebecca turned around Thomas. I just scanned the QR code on the system. She is indeed a pilot of the airline, the real chief pilot. There was a sudden silence. Thomas blinked, then looked at Nicole. She was still sitting, her hand resting lightly on her notebook, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, The sky was changing color. The dark clouds had rolled into swirling, smoky bands. Rebecca bent down and whispered, "Do you think we should alert the cockpit?" "Yes. Now." "Okay, I'll go." She left, walking quickly but still maintaining a calm demeanor, something only people with true intuition can do. Nicole watched, then tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear, the sound of wind hitting the wings, mixed with the steady vibration of metal. She knew the storm was still far away, but the wind was always more truthful than men. Thomas turned back, his voice low, as if to save face. "You seem to believe you understand the plane better than the people flying it," Nicole replied softly, her eyes not leaving the window frame. "I don't believe it. I just... Listen, a simple statement." But it left Thomas choked. For the first time, he couldn't find a rebuttal. The plane shook again harder. A coffee tray slid off the table and fell on a passenger's feet. A few small screams rang out. Nicole looked at her watch, calmly pulled out her cell phone, and dialed the number to the cockpit. "This is Nicole Williams, Chief Pilot. Flight 447 is entering low-level shear winds. I recommend monitoring wind speeds and considering increasing altitude." The other end of the line was silent for a few seconds. Then a middle-aged, heavily breathing male voice replied, "Roger. That we'll monitor. Thanks for the heads up." "Chief?" Thomas froze. That voice, the voice of Captain James Mitchell, the captain of the flight. And he had just called the 15-year-old girl Chief. The first-class cabin was strangely silent. Thomas swallowed, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't dare look at Nicole. Rebecca turned back and whispered, "Mitchell confirmed. They're checking the radar." "Good." Nicole nodded. "Keep the passengers calm." She spoke in a soft but authoritative command. No shouting, no show of force, just enough to let the listener know what to do. Thomas leaned back and sat down in the empty row of chairs. Not because he was tired, but because for the first time in years, he felt small in his own uniform. Outside, the clouds thickened, lightning streaked across the gray sky, the sound of metal vibrating steadily, mixed with the heartbeats in the cabin. Nicole sat still, her hands clasped together. It was strangely calm. She had learned to live with storms both outside and inside. The sky outside was no longer a gentle gray. It was thick, dark as hot iron, waiting for the first lightning strike to explode. Flight 447 rolled slightly to the right, then stabilized, as if trying to keep calm before nature's fury. On board, everyone still believed everything was under control. Only Nicole Williams, a 15-year-old girl in a pilot's uniform, understood that the piece was only a fragile shell before a real test. The engines roared as the Boeing broke through the thick clouds. The rain pounded against the fuselage, each beat like a heart drum. The lights outside were almost extinguished. Only the cockpit lights shone out, reflecting through the closed door. In the cockpit, Captain James Mitchell, a seasoned 55-year-old, leaned forward. He felt a sharp pain in his left chest. His hand touched it, squeezed, then released, trying to hide the pain. "Everything's fine," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly. Sir David Jenkins, the young co-pilot, looked up. "Nothing. Just keep the heading, maintain altitude." David nodded, but his eyes flashed with worry. He was only 26, still learning to trust his instincts more than the clock. Outside, the plane was shaking violently. The indicators were oscillating, wind speed varied. Pressure dropped slightly. The atmospheric collision warning system flashed red. David glanced at the radar, then said softly, "Captain, I think we're hitting a vertical shear. Just a pocket. Keep her steady. But in that moment, the altimeter needle jumped. The plane dropped a few hundred feet, then jerked back up. The pain in Mitchell's chest grew worse. He tried to hide it, sweat forming on his temples. In first class, a violent shaking knocked over a few glasses. A little girl cried out, her mother's screams mingling with the engine noise. Nicole remained seated, her hands on the armrests, her eyes looking out. She saw that the clouds were no longer moving in a steady rhythm. They were swirling, pressing tightly against the fuselage. She muttered, "They're flying too low." Thomas, trying to keep his balance, turned back. "What did you say?" "The strong troposphere is below 36,000 feet. They're at about 32. If they don't climb, they'll get locked in the vortex." Thomas looked at her, no longer daring to laugh as before. "And you knew that, just by looking out the window. No, by listening." The wind was changing its tune. That statement made him pause. She did not speak like a child guessing, but like someone who had heard the wind talk all her life. In the cockpit, Mitchell struggled to hold the wheel. His pulse was pounding. David panicked. "Sir, are you okay?" "I said keep her steady," Mitchell growled, but the last syllable trembled. A long beep sounded. "Alarm. Altitude deviation, 30 beyond 400 feet. David looked at the control panel, his hands shaking. "We're dropping, sir. We're losing altitude fast." "Correct it." "Nose up." Gently, Mitchell pulled the lever, but the force of the airplane was too strong, shaking the plane violently. He gritted his teeth, trying to hold his breath, but the pain in his chest was like a knife. Sweat ran down his collar, soaking him. David tried to turn the knob, but the engine was sluggish. "We're not stabilizing." "Hold it steady." Mitchell choked mid-sentence. His hands dropped from the steering wheel. David turned back. Captain Mitchell slumped against the dashboard. The scene played out in a split second. In the cabin, a violent jolt threw several people from their seats. Screams rang out. The plane plummeted several hundred feet before stopping abruptly, as if someone's heart had been squeezed. Thomas bumped into a chair and slid down. Rebecca rushed over, holding the intercom. "Cockpit's not responding." Nicole stood up. "Give me the communication device." Rebecca looked at her. Her voice panicked. "What are you going to do if they don't respond?" "We need to find out." "I know what's going on." Thomas shouted. "You can't, I can. And I will." Her voice was low, but steady as steel. She picked up the phone and pressed the key combination. "This is Chief Pilot Nicole Williams. What's the cockpit status?" There was a pause. Then David's voice rang out, hoarse and panicked. "Captain Mitchell. He's down, I repeat. He's down. I need help." The whole cabin held its breath. Thomas looked at Nicole, his eyes wide. The young girl took a deep breath and said calmly, "I'm coming up." She turned to Rebecca. "Keep passengers in order. Close the trunk. Fasten seat belts in all rows." Rebecca nodded, her eyes full of trust. Thomas stood still, not daring to stop him. She walked past him, her voice very soft. "I told you. Wind shear doesn't warn with sound. It warns with rhythm." He looked on, unable to say a word. Nicole walked to the cockpit door. The red light said locked. She knocked twice, then punched in the emergency code. After a few seconds, the lock released. The door opened slightly, and dim blue light spilled into the hallway. Inside, Mitchell lay slumped, his head resting on the dashboard, while David tried to hold the plane, his hands shaking. Without a word, Nicole walked in and pulled out the captain's chair. "Move aside." "Officer Jenkins." David stopped. "Who are you?" Chief Pilot Williams, Skyway Airlines, let's not waste time. Her voice was cold, firm, and clear as a command. David saw the 4 yellow stripes on her shoulder, the badge worn only by the highest commander. He stammered, "Yes, ma'am." She sat down in the chair, placed her hands on the controls, and scanned the dashboard. "Altitude 31,100. We're dropping too fast." She turned on the communication. "Flight 447 requesting immediate climb to FL 370. Severe wind shear confirmed." The control center replied, its voice tense. "Copy that. Chief Williams, you're cleared to climb." She pulled the lever, gently but firmly. The plane shook violently, then slowly regained its balance. David looked at her, breathing heavily. "How did you know?" "'Cause I've been listening to the storm since we left Chicago." In the passenger compartment, everyone held on to the handrails. Rebecca looked out the closed cockpit door, where she had just seen Nicole enter. Thomas sat down, his hands clasped together, his eyes on the ceiling light for the first time in his life. He was praying for someone he had previously despised. Skyway Flight 447 temporarily gained altitude, but the sky ahead did not calm down. Walls of dark clouds swirled, pressing down on the plane. Lightning flashed, bright enough to reflect Nicole Williams' face in the cockpit. Her eyes were calm, but deep down, she knew this storm was more than nature's test. It was a test of faith, of reason, prejudice, and human life. A loud boom rang out, shaking the entire plane. The plane shook violently. The lights in the cabin flashed continuously, and several suitcases fell out of the overhead compartment and hit the floor, causing the passengers to scream. A long metallic screech sounded like the howling wind. Oxygen masks popped out, swinging in front of everyone like hundreds of arms pleading for help. Rebecca rushed out into the aisle, trying to calm the passengers. "Please stay calm. Wear your oxygen masks and hold your seat belts." Thomas Richardson stood transfixed. He saw genuine fear in the people's eyes, a fear he had never seen on such a scale in his 18 years of flying. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell lay slumped, breathing heavily, his hands twitching. First Officer David Jenkins tried to take control, but sweat drenched his face and his eyes filled with panic. "We're losing altitude 29,000, 28,500. The alarm sounded incessantly. The fan blades hit the headwind, creating a shrill screech. David tried to turn the stick, but overreacted, and the plane banked nearly 40 degrees. Everything fell out of place. Tablet, notebook, water bottle flying up in the moment of zero gravity, then crashing to the floor. Nicole grabbed the handrail, keeping her balance, her voice rising above the warning. "They're flying wrong altitude." "Wrong layer," Rebecca heard and shouted. "What do you mean, updraft?" "They're in an inverted convection zone. They have to climb. They can't stay here with that." Nicole yanked her seatbelt and rushed toward the cockpit. Thomas called after her. "What are you doing? Save us." The cockpit door opened just as the plane slid free again. Nicole gripped the door frame and pulled herself into the cockpit. David was almost out of control. The screen was flashing red. The stall warning was blaring. Pull up. Pull up terrain alert. Nicole weak. "Let me in the seat." David turned back, surprised. "Who the hell are you?" "Chief Pilot Williams. Skyway Airlines, move." Her voice was not loud, but it was so firm that it drowned out the warning. David almost instinctively gave up his seat. Nicole sat down, hands on the joystick, eyes darting across the display panel. Autopilot disengaged, manual control. She pushed the stick gently, regaining her balance. The altitude needle stopped at 27,900 feet, then slowly climbed. "Come on, climb with me," she whispered, her voice as if talking to the plane itself. In the passenger compartment, People were still panicking. Rebecca kept calm, holding on to the seat. "Ladies and gentlemen, please breathe deeply. The plane is being readjusted." Thomas stood back, looking at the closed cockpit door. He thought of the girl he had laughed at that morning, the one who now held the fate of more than 200 people in her hands. He muttered softly, almost praying, "Please, little girl, keep us in the cockpit." Nicole was calculating the wind speed. She looked at the radar screen, making a quick analysis. The crosswind from the southwest was cutting into the tail of the plane, the reason why the Boeing was pushed down. She pressed the internal switch and said briefly to David, "Keep engine speed at 88%. Adjust nose rudder angle up 4 degrees. No more. But do it." David did as he was told. The plane still shook, but stopped falling. She took a deep breath. "Good. We're stabilizing." David looked at her, stunned. How old are you? Enough to know when not to be afraid." Outside, the sky lit up with a huge bolt of lightning. The light flashed across Nicole's face, neat, focused, without a trace of fear. She looked out the window. The clouds seemed to be swirling around the plane, layer by layer. She said softly, "If we stay here, the wind will tear us apart." Then she turned on the radio. "ATC. This is Chief Pilot Williams. Flight 447, severe turbulence, requesting emergency climb to FL 370. We're currently at 28,000 and climbing." Static sound rang out. Then the control voice replied, "Roger that. 447. Cleared to climb. Stay safe up there." "Chief?" She pursed her lips and nodded slightly. "We will." The plane began to climb. The wind still whistled, but less sharply. The vibrations faded to a gentle sway, as if the wild beast outside was beginning to soften under the hands of its tamer. David turned to look, his voice still in disbelief. "Are you really Chief Pilot?" "No, I'm just someone who was taught that the skies are no place for those who lose their temper." A slight smile crossed her lips, but her gaze remained fixed forward into the swirling night. Inside the cabin, the passengers were still shaking, but the screams had quieted down. Rebecca looked at Thomas and whispered, "See, she's holding the plane." Thomas said nothing. He just nodded, slowly, his eyes glinting in the dim light. At 42, he thought he understood what professionalism and bravery were. But now, in the midst of the storm, he realized true bravery has no age or skin color. The tremor returned, stronger for a few seconds, but this time, Nicole didn't let it overwhelm her. She adjusted the stick, her voice even. "Hold steady. Don't fight it. Just dance with it." David looked over, eyes wide. "Dance. Yes. You can't fight the wind. You flow with it until it lets you go." The plane tilted slightly, then leveled out. The alarm went off. All was silent, the most precious silence in the sky. Nicole took a deep breath and looked at the reading. 36,800 feet. 37,000 feet. She whispered, "We made it?" David chuckled, relieved. "You saved us." "No. The sky just wanted to see if we still deserved to fly. The plane has cleared the turbulence, but the sky is still as dark as thick steel." In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell is motionless, while David Jenkins, the young co-pilot, holds the steering wheel trembling as if clinging to the last thread between life and death. In the passenger compartment, no one knows what is happening. Only vibrations, thunder, and prayers broken in the darkness. Nicole Williams stood up in the midst of the chaos, calm but determined. Skyway Flight 447 shuddered again. A suitcase fell from the overhead bin, hit the floor, and flew open. The air in the cabin was heavy, the only sound being the wind whistling outside the fuselage. Thomas Richardson gripped the handrail and shouted, "Sit down, kid. This is no game." Nicole turned back, her eyes as cold as Lake Michigan in midwinter. "I'm not playing, Mr. Richardson. I'm Chief Pilot Nicole Williams. I need to get to the cockpit, now." The first-class cabin was dead silent. Rebecca stood behind, stunned. Thomas, after a few seconds, burst out laughing in disbelief. "Chief Pilot, you come on, stop joking. You're only 15. Who do you think you are? A hero in a movie." Nicole did not answer immediately. She looked straight into his eyes, her voice low and slow, each word falling like a knife. "I don't think so. I know who I am. And if I don't go in there, we won't have a chance." The wind howled louder. The plane shook again, making them both stagger. Rebecca stepped forward, took Nicole's hand to steady herself, and said quickly, "Thomas, she's telling the truth. I've verified her ID. She's the pilot, chief pilot of the airline." Thomas stood frozen. The words chief pilot of the airline seemed to knock down all the walls in his head, but the old self still clung to him, the instinct to control, to believe he was right. "Impossible," he muttered. "She's just a child." Nicole stepped closer, her voice not loud, but enough to make him take a step back. "Either help me save these people, or get out of my way." In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The sound of the wind outside turned into a somber background music, and all eyes in the cabin turned to the young girl, a small figure in a pilot's uniform with 4 faint yellow stripes. Thomas swallowed. His eyes met hers, and he saw not 15 years, but the age of thousands of hours of flying, of someone who had known loss and no longer feared storms. The plane shook violently. A small explosion sounded somewhere below, making the passengers scream. Rebecca shouted, "Nicole, go, I'll take care of this." Nicole nodded, then turned to Thomas one last time. "I need you to open the cockpit door. The emergency code is only for senior flight attendants. If you really are a professional, prove it." Thomas looked at her, then around. Dozens of eyes followed him. In that moment, he understood he could either be the one who prevented life, or he could be the one who helped it. Without another word, he walked to the code pad, entered 3 characters, then a series of numbers. The locked light changed to ready. Nicole put her hand on the door and took a deep breath. The wind howled. The lights flashed. Everyone held their breath. Then she said softly, "To no one in particular, Dad, if you can hear me, guide my hands." The door opens. Inside, the cockpit light was a pale, cold blue. Mitchell was slumped over, his face pale, while Jenkins struggled with the controls, sweat pouring from his face. Nicole entered, gently signaling Rebecca to lock the door behind her. "Chief Pilot Williams reporting." "What's the status?" David Jenkins turned back. "Surprised you. You really are the chief pilot. We have no time to doubt. Officer Jenkins, altitude 26,000 and dropping fast." "Good. We climbed to 37,000. Now." She sat in the captain's chair, the seat where someone had just collapsed, without hesitation. David looked at her, his hands shaking with fear and amazement. The 15-year-old girl before him acted like someone who had been flying all her life. Autopilot disengaged. Check. Wind shear angle, 15 degrees crosswind. Got it. Every sentence, every movement, was short and precise. Jenkins followed her commands like a student follows the breath of his teacher. In the passenger compartment, the vibration was still there, but the light was more stable. Rebecca turned back and said to Thomas, "She's in the cockpit." Thomas slumped in his chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes distant. "Oh, my God! I stopped someone like that. Mrs. Margaret Michael, an elderly passenger sitting nearby, gently placed her hand on his shoulder. The important thing is that you stepped aside when necessary. None of us are perfect, Thomas. But that girl, she reminded me that courage has no age." Thomas bowed his head. For the first time in years, he felt small and light. In the cockpit, Nicole adjusted the steering angle and said quickly, "Jenkins, hold 290 knots. I'll get the plane out of sheer." "Understood." She checked the dashboard, her voice steady, without a tremor. Altitude 28,000 and climbing. The plane shook, then slowly stabilized. The red lights on the dashboard turned off one by one. David looked over. "What? Have you done nothing complicated? Just don't fight the storm. Learn to fly with it." The words echoed in the cockpit. Simple, but like a lifelong lesson. Outside, the dark clouds parted. A thin ray of light filtered through, illuminating her face. The light made Nicole's uniform with its 4 yellow stripes glow against the pale blue. David sat still. He had never seen anyone so calm, especially a teenage girl. She turned off the internal radio and said softly, "Tell cabin crew to reassure passengers. We're regaining full control." David did as she was told. Her voice echoed through the system. "This is Chief Pilot Williams speaking. We've encountered a severe turbulence, but the situation is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Thank you for your calm and cooperation." The cabin was silent for a few seconds. Then there was applause, not unanimous, but heartfelt. People who had never believed in a child now believed in her more than anyone else in the sky. The applause in the cabin gradually died down, leaving only a faint echo like the aftertaste of the miracle that had just happened. Thomas Richardson was still standing there, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door. He knew, just by stepping through that door, his worldview would never be the same again. On the other side, a 15-year-old girl was sitting in the captain's seat, controlling the giant iron bird in the middle of the storm, and perhaps also controlling the trust of those who had long lost respect. The storm had not yet passed. The plane continued to rock slightly, but no one was panicking now. Rebecca was helping passengers secure their seatbelts, while Thomas continued to stare at the cockpit door, mesmerized. Then from the intercom came Captain James Mitchell's voice, weak, broken, but clear. "This is Captain Mitchell. Send her up, immediately." The cabin was dead silent. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind hitting the fuselage. A wail, like the distant sea. Thomas froze. He turned to Rebecca, his face drained of color. "Send her up." Rebecca nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. He called Nicole, Captain Mitchell himself. All eyes turned to Nicole Williams, the little girl in the pilot uniform, still holding her captain's cap as a promise to her late father. She took a deep breath, stood up, and adjusted her collar. No pride, no arrogance, just a strange calm, as if she had known this moment would come. She turned to Thomas. "You heard me. I have to go in there." Thomas opened his mouth to say something, but his throat tightened. All the words he had said to her costume, sweetheart, diversity hire reverberated like broken glass, stabbing at her heart. "You are really Chief Pilot Nicole Williams, Skyway Airlines," she replied, light and short, like a fact that needed no proof. She looked around the cabin. The passengers, who had been silent until now, made way. A middle-aged white man stood up and took his suitcase aside. An elderly woman nodded and whispered, "Go, child. Go save us." Thomas stepped back. He watched her pass him, feeling as if he were watching part of the old world crumble to make way for something more right. Rebecca ran after her, handing her the communication device. "Nicole, I'll connect you to the cockpit. They're waiting." She nodded. "Thank you. I need everyone to stay calm. The plane will be completely stabilized in a few minutes." Rebecca smiled softly, her eyes moist. "I believe you." Nicole stood in front of the cockpit door. The red locked light was still on. She pressed the interphone button, her voice cold and calm. "This is Chief Pilot Williams, requesting access." A few seconds later, Mitchell's voice rang out, faint but clear. "Send her up. Now." Rebecca entered the emergency code. There was a click. The red light turned green. The door opened, and the cockpit light flooded into the passenger compartment, the pale green light of radar, reflecting off Nicole's face. In that moment, the entire flight fell silent. No more crying, no more wind. Just the image of a slim black girl, in pilot uniform, walking slowly between the rows of first-class seats, toward the open door where every soul was waiting for her. Thomas Richardson watched, unblinking. It felt like time had stopped. Memories of his 18 years in the airline industry played back in his mind, serving the rich, bowing to rude passengers, thinking there should be no black people in the cockpit. Now, the black girl was walking past him without a word. "Thomas," Rebecca said softly, "you should consider yourself lucky. Not everyone gets the chance to see justice pass through their lives." Thomas didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes following Nicole's figure as she disappeared through the door. The door closed with a small click, a simple sound, but louder than thunder. The cabin fell silent again. Mrs. Margaret Michael, the elderly woman sitting in the front row, slowly placed her hand on her chest and said softly, "Oh my God, that little girl is the one who keeps our lives together." Derek Johnson, a black businessman, smiled slightly and nodded, "And the one who keeps my faith in this world." Inside the cockpit, light reflected off Mitchell's face. He lay in his chair, breathing heavily. The door opened, and Nicole stepped in. David Jenkins turned his head, almost stunned. "Chief Williams." Nicole raised her hand, signaling him to continue driving. "Hold steady. I'm here." She walked over to Mitchell and placed 2 fingers on his wrist. There was a pulse. He opened his eyes wearily. "I knew. You'd come. Rest, Captain. We've got it from here." He tried to smile, very slightly. "Show them how a real pilot flies." Nicole nodded. She sat in the captain's seat, the place that had once belonged to that man, pulled up her seatbelt, her hands on the steering wheel, as calm as if this was the only place she belonged. Outside, the clouds were still rolling, but between the thick layers, a small crack of light opened. The light shone directly into the cockpit window, reflecting off the small letters printed on the dashboard Skyway Airlines. "Fly with integrity." Nicole looked at the words for a long time, then whispered, "Integrity. Yes, that's what keeps us flying." In the passenger cabin, Thomas sat down, facing forward. He could no longer see Nicole, but he felt her there, like the heartbeat of the plane. Rebecca stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay? I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But Maybe I just witnessed something I need to relearn all my life respect. As the cockpit door closed behind her, all the sounds of the passenger compartment disappeared. There was only the sound of the wind whistling like a knife around the fuselage, and Captain Mitchell's weak breathing mixed with the urgent warnings on the control panel. Nicole Williams stepped in, carrying not only calm, but also the last hope of the 200 people left on that flight. A dim blue light filled the cockpit. The air smelled of burning plastic, ozone, and tension. Captain James Mitchell sat slouched, sweat dripping down his collar. His hands shook slightly, his eyes half closed. David Jenkins, the 26-year-old co-pilot, tried to turn the controls, but the movements were clumsy and rushed. On the radar screen, the wind trails intersected in a swirling pattern, chaotic and dangerous. "Captain, we're losing altitude again. 28,000 and dropping, Sir Captain. Please." Mitchell opened his eyes, his voice broken. "David, listen. Let her fly." Jenkins turned, surprised to see Nicole Williams standing behind him. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, but her face was strangely calm. "Chief Pilot Williams reporting," she said shortly. "I'll take over." David stopped, both surprised and doubtful. Who are you, a girl?" "It can't be." Mitchell tried to lift his hand and touch David's shoulder. "She's chief pilot. Do as she says." Nicole walked to the captain's seat. Without another word, she took hold of the steering wheel, placing her right hand on the thrust control. Her voice was calm, even, and unhurried. "David, check the crosswinds. 50. No, 65 knots. Too strong for the current level. We're getting caught in the shear zone." She glanced at the controls. Speed dropped. Pressure increased. A small, almost imperceptible turn of the stick, but the whole plane stabilized. Autopilot disengaged. Check. Heading 174. Maintain frontal wind. Do not fight it. David looked over, his mouth opening and closing. Every movement she made precise, rhythmic, was as if she were flying with the wind, not against it. Mitchell whispered, "She learned from her father. Navy pilot. Good man." Nicole bowed her head slightly and said in a low voice, "Rest, Captain. You've done enough." Then she turned on the radio, her voice deep and precise like a seasoned commander, ATC. "This is Chief Pilot Williams, Skyway 447. Captain Mitchell is incapacitated. I'm taking command. Request climb to FL 370 to exit wind shear zone." From the radio came the controller's voice, startled by the news he had just received. "Repeat. Chief Williams. Did you say Chief Pilot Williams affirmative? Quo Jap. Skyway 447 is under control. Requesting climb to 370. There was a long silence. Then the male voice on the other end of the line trembled slightly. "Permission granted. Chief Williams. You're cleared to climb." Nicole pushed the thrust lever gently. The engine roared. The fuselage shook and gradually pulled up. "David, keep an eye on the attitude gauge. We're climbing 3 degrees. No more. 3 degrees. Confirmed. Good. Now look out. Don't just look at the gauge. Feel how the wind reacts." David leaned over and looked out the window. Outside, clouds swirled, but higher up he saw a glimmer of light, the beginning of the sky. "I see," he whispered. "That's where we need to go," Nicole said. "Calm down and listen to the rhythm of the engine. Don't fight it. Let it." For the next few minutes no one spoke. There was only the ticking of the clock and the fading sound of the wind. The Boeing 737 climbed through 33 doors, 34 doors, 36 feet. When the indicator reached FL 370, 37 feet, the plane stabilized completely. Nicole let go of the steering wheel, took a deep breath, her voice as light as a breath. "We're clear." David lay back, breathing heavily, sweat running down his cheeks. "You just saved us." "No," she replied. "I was just doing what I was taught. Never let fear blind you." Mitchell gave a weak smile. "That's leadership." She turned to David, her voice soft, like a teacher. "David, remember this. A good pilot is not one who is not afraid, but one who remains in control when he is afraid. I won't forget," he said, his eyes still fixed on her, admiration mixed with shame. Nicole nodded slightly, then handed him a tissue. "Wipe your brow. Jenkins, the storm is only dangerous when we lose our cool." Outside, the dark clouds gradually dispersed, revealing a calm blue sky. Sunlight shone through the glass, reflecting on her face, youthful but with the experienced look of someone who had suffered much loss. On her wrist, a dark leather bracelet, engraved with the 2 letters R.W., Robert Williams, the name of her late father. She smiled slightly, as if talking to herself. "We made it, Dad." In the passenger compartment, the light gradually returned. Rebecca announced over the loudspeaker, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have cleared the turbulence zone. The aircraft is now stable at 37,000 feet. Please keep your seat belts fastened until further notice." The applause rang out, this time for a long time. Thomas Richardson sat motionless, his eyes red. He didn't know if he was moved by the fact that he had survived, or by the fact that he had just witnessed something that would change the rest of his life. A black girl, barely out of her teens, teaching the world about composure and dignity. In the cockpit, Nicole leaned over to look at Mitchell. He was asleep, breathing more evenly. She adjusted the thin blanket around his shoulders, then turned back to look outside. David asked softly, "Are you still afraid?" "No," she replied, her eyes on the horizon. "Because fear never teaches us to fly. It only teaches us to fall." As Nicole Williams stabilized the plane at 37,000 feet, she tilted her head to look out the window. The sky ahead gradually changed from leaden gray to pale blue, and a faint yellow light began to penetrate the remaining layers of dark clouds. On the ground, the storms continued to rage, but here in the highest heavens there was absolute silence. A silence she had regained with all her wisdom, not with her power. The atmosphere in the cockpit was different now. The warning stopped. There was only the soft, steady sound of the engines, like the deep breathing of someone who had just escaped. On the dashboard, all the indicator lights gradually turned green, a symbol of control and safety. David Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Nicole. He said nothing, just looked at her silently, as if afraid any word would break the silence. Nicole spoke slowly, her voice soft and gentle as the wind. "We're in the strong troposphere. It ends just below 36,000 feet. Once we get past that, the winds will shift, and the air will stabilize again." David looked up and nodded. You knew that from the beginning?" "No," Nicole replied, smiling slightly. "I just guessed, based on the way the clouds swirled and the way the wind reacted to the plane's fuselage." A moment of silence passed. David sighed, smiled softly, his voice still trembling. "I trained for 10 years and never thought about listening to the wind." Nicole tilted her head, her eyes warm and deep. "That's what my father taught me. In the air, the wind is not your enemy. It's your music, and you have to learn to play with it." Beside him, Captain James Mitchell stirred slightly. He opened his eyes, a tired smile appearing on his face. "You flew beautifully, Chief Williams." "Thank you, Captain. You should rest. I will bring this flight back safely." "I know. I saw it in you, the day you entered the training program." Nicole turned around, surprised. "You remember," Mitchell nodded slightly, "a 13-year-old girl, standing in the Skyway instructor selection, the youngest in the room, but the only one who wasn't looking at the screen during the flight simulator. She was looking out the window. Because I thought, planes don't have to fight the sky. They just have to understand it. And now you've proven it. Nicole." His voice faded, but his eyes remained bright. Nicole looked at him, and for a moment, she didn't see the commander. She saw the figure of her late father, Robert Williams, in his Navy uniform, who had taught her the same thing. Nicole adjusted the controls, her voice even and clear, then turned on the radio to contact Air Traffic Control ATC. "ATC. This is Chief Pilot Williams. Skyway Flight 447. We are stable at FL 370. Captain Mitchell status temporarily unconscious. Stable breathing. Requesting medical assistance upon landing." The controller's voice replied, calm but full of respect. "Received, Chief Williams. You're doing a hell of a job up there." Nicole smiled softly. "Just doing my job, sir." She cut the call, put herself back on autopilot, and leaned back. Her voice, heard only by David people, don't always believe they can do it. But sometimes they don't have to believe. They just have to see. In the cabin, Rebecca Martinez reported that the situation was stable. The passengers gradually breathed a sigh of relief, and some began to pray in thanksgiving. Thomas Richardson sat still, his eyes fixed on the cockpit door. The light reflected on his face, a face that contained both regret and a little peace. "You know," Rebecca said softly, "we're all thanks to that girl." "I know," Thomas said, his voice choking, "and I don't know how to look at her any more. I said things to her that I'm ashamed to remember. It's okay." Rebecca smiled. She doesn't mind. Some people are so strong they don't have to prove anything. Thomas was silent. His eyes never left the door where Nicole worked. He knew in his heart that from now on, he would no longer judge anyone by their color or age. Back in the cockpit, David wrote in the flight log. His hands were still shaking, but his handwriting was less shaky. Nicole sat still, her eyes on the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing the sun, a giant gold coin, illuminating the cockpit. Mitchell moved slightly, his voice weak. "Nicole." "Yes, Captain. I've been flying for 30 years, but I've never seen anyone own the sky like you did today." "No one owns the sky, Captain," she replied. "We just have permission to stay." Mitchell smiled, the calm smile of someone who knows he has been succeeded by a more worthy generation. About 10 minutes later, the radio came on Skyway 447 ATC. "The storm area has moved southeast. You may maintain your current flight path. Everything is clear." "Copy that, ATC," Nicole replied. "Thank you for your guidance." She turned off the radio, turned to David, and said softly, "Now remember this feeling. When the sky goes silent, that's the moment every pilot lives for." David nodded, his eyes lighting up as if he had been opened to something bigger than his profession, a philosophy of life. On the ground, the air traffic controllers were still talking. A strange, calm, precise voice identified itself as Chief Pilot Williams. When they checked the records, many were stunned by the words age 15. Rank Chief Pilot, status active. At 37,000 feet, Nicole Williams sat still in her captain's chair, Her hands clasped together, her eyes closed. Not out of pride, not out of elation, just because she could finally breathe lightly and deeply. At 37,000 feet, the Boeing 737 flies through air as clear as a storm. Nicole Williams leans back in her captain's chair, the sunset covering her face in a gossamer gold. Below, the city of Atlanta appears the first dots of light flickering in the evening sky. The flight is out of danger, but her journey still has the most important part, getting everyone back to the ground, safely and doing it with silence. Not applause. The sky darkened. The last clouds parted, revealing the lights of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport below, glowing like an upside-down galaxy. Nicole tuned the radio, her voice calm and professional, each note as solid as steel Atlanta Tower. This is Skyway 447. We are preparing to approach runway 26L, requesting landing instructions. The air traffic controller's voice replied, "Short and clear. Skyway 447. This is Atlanta Tower. Northwest winds. 12 knots. Runway 26L clear. You are cleared to land. Chief Williams, good luck." The words Chief Williams made David Jenkins glance over. He still couldn't quite believe that the person sitting next to him was a 15-year-old girl and someone who had just saved more than 200 lives. "Do you want me to help you?" Nicole shook her head, as light as a nod. "You just need to trust me." No one spoke in the cabin. Only the pale yellow light reflected off everyone's tense faces. Thomas Richardson sat upright, his hands gripping the seat in front of him, his eyes fixed on the slowly emerging runway lights in the window. Rebecca Martinez silently held the hand of an elderly passenger. She could feel the woman's heart pounding. "That girl," she whispered, "is she really flying the plane?" "Yes," Rebecca replied softly. "And she's taking us home." Inside the cockpit, Nicole did a final checklist check. Flaps 30. Flaps 30. Confirm. Gear down. Gear down. 3 green lights. The landing gear lowered. A dry sound echoed through the fuselage, the sound that signaled the decisive moment had arrived. Mitchell remained in the passenger seat, his eyes blurred but still facing forward. "Nicole," he said softly, "let me see. You're landing." Nicole smiled, her voice soft and steady. "Yes, Captain. Let me see what a butter landing is." The plane lost altitude. The cabin pressure changed. Passengers' ears rang. The world seemed to hold its breath. From 10,000 feet, 5,000, then 2,000. Runway. 26L lights shine like guiding stars. Speed, 145 knots. David read. "Steady," Nicole replied. "Altitude 900 feet. Looking good. Keep straight." Her voice did not tremble. Not high, not low. Just steady like the beat of a heartbeat in sync with the rhythm of an engine. A gentle breeze shook the wings. Nicole held the controls firmly, adjusting them delicately like an artist plucking a string. From the outside, the Boeing banked slightly, then straightened, diving as if gliding on fine silk. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. The wheel hit the ground. There was a slight hiss. No jerk, no shake, just a smooth touch, like touching still water. Skyway 447 officially landed. Outside, the lights of the runway reflected off the plane's body, as if welcoming it back from the war. David breathed a sigh of relief, turned to Nicole, almost not believing his eyes. That was perfect. "We're not done yet," she replied, her hands still on the joystick, not at a complete stop. She gently pulled the engine brake lever. The plane slowed down, rolled slowly, and then stopped amid cheers from the passenger cabin. In the cabin, people burst into tears. Some hugged each other. Some bowed their heads in prayer. There was applause, not loud, but choked, like the breathing of those who had just crossed the line between life and death. Thomas Richardson bowed his head, tears streaming down his cheeks. He did not know whether he was crying from fear, or from regret, or from something greater, the shame washed away by the courage of a child he had despised. Rebecca stood beside him, looking towards the cockpit, her voice trembling. "She did it." Thomas nodded slightly. "No, she did it before. It's just that today, the world realized it." In the cockpit, Nicole read the checklist again. Parking brake, set. Engine 1, shut down. Engine 2, shut down. Hydraulics, off. She unbuckled her seatbelt, let out a long breath, then turned to David. "Call a paramedic right away. Captain Mitchell needs medical attention." David nodded, quickly contacting the ground. Meanwhile, Nicole gently removed her captain's cap, placing it on Mitchell's lap. "You took me to the sky. The rest, I just helped you land." Mitchell smiled weakly, tears rolling down the corners of his eyes. "You just made your father proud." "Nicole, I hope so." "Captain." The cockpit door opened. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a stretcher toward Mitchell. Nicole stepped back, made room, then stood tall and saluted in full airline protocol. No boasting, no triumphant smile. Just respect to the sky, to the profession, and to the man himself. As the paramedics carried Captain Mitchell out of the cockpit, the passengers stood along the aisle. They were silent. Then, as if on cue, they turned to Nicole, who was standing at the cockpit door. The applause broke out again, this time, without stopping. Thomas approached and stopped in front of her. He spoke softly, his voice hoarse as if he had never apologized before in his life. "Chief Williams, I don't know what to say other than thank you, and I'm sorry." Nicole looked at him, her eyes gentle but determined. "The important thing is that you can still say it. Not everyone has the courage to do so." She turned back to look at the passenger compartment. 200 faces, 200 lives, all looking at her with the same feeling respect. Not because of skin color, not because of age, but because of an undeniable truth. Ability does not wear a uniform, only courage. When the plane door opened, the Atlanta night air rushed in, carrying the smell of a damp earth and gasoline from the runway. Nicole Williams took off her gloves and walked slowly out of the cockpit. Behind her, the red and blue flashing lights of the ambulance reflected off the light streaks on the fuselage, like still beating hearts, a reminder that just a few minutes ago, they were all on the brink of death. But now, everything was back, and with it was silence, a different silence, no longer of fear, but of awareness. The ambulance crew quickly loaded Captain James Mitchell onto a stretcher. He was conscious and held Nicole's hand tightly before being taken down to the runway. "You did what I could not," he said weakly, "and you kept the promise of the sky." Nicole nodded slightly, squeezing his hand. "You rest. Captain, I'll just fly the path you opened." As Mitchell was taken away, the passengers left the plane one by one. They all looked at her differently, no longer with suspicion, no longer with curiosity, but with quiet respect. Thomas Richardson remained standing in the middle of the crowd. He neither moved nor spoke. His hands clutched his worn stewardess cap, the rim damp with sweat. Nicole stepped forward, stopping a few feet from him. The light from the hallway reflected off her uniform 4 bright yellow stripes on her shoulders, making it hard for him to see. "Chief Pilot Williams," Thomas began, his voice hoarse and trembling. I don't know where to start." "Well, let's start with the truth," Nicole said softly. Whatever you think, just say it. He took a deep breath, his eyes looking down at the cold, shiny metal floor. I was wrong. Not just today, but probably for the rest of my life. I thought I understood the world. I understood this profession. But it turns out, I was only looking at it through the lens of fear. He looked up. His voice choked. When I saw you walk into the cockpit, I realized my prejudice was worse than any storm out there. And if you had been angry or wanted to retaliate, I would have understood. But you didn't. Nicole was silent. She just looked at him, her gaze so calm it made him feel naked. You did the right thing when it mattered, she replied. When I needed to get in touch, you didn't stop me. That's what matters. Thomas shook his head. You can still report me. I deserve to be disciplined for that behavior. If I do, Nicole said softly, we will be teaching people how to fear, not how to learn. I choose to believe that you will change, and I will recommend that you be recognized for your assistance in the emergency. He looked up. Surprised you? Will acknowledge me, because you deserve the best of yourself. No one is perfect, but everyone has a chance to be right. They just have to choose the right time to do it. The words rang out like the final note in the chaotic symphony of the flight. No one needed to applaud. No one needed to justify. Both of them just stood there, in silence, one learning humility, the other teaching the world to forgive with wisdom. From a distance, Rebecca Martinez approached, holding a clipboard and several reports. She smiled at Nicole. Medical confirmation. Captain Mitchell is stable. He wants to see you when he wakes up. Good. Nicole nodded. We can file the report tonight. Rebecca looked at Thomas, then back at Nicole, and said softly, I have never seen anyone handle things so calmly. Nicole replied with only one sentence, almost whispering, if anger could save people, I would have chosen it long ago. Rebecca was silent. She understood. It wasn't an excuse, it was a philosophy. On the runway, the wind blew. Another plane was about to take off, the roar of its engine making Nicole's hair sway. She watched, her eyes deep and far away, as if looking somewhere else, where her father had stood, with his navy cap in hand, teaching his daughter no one can fly forever in anger. To rise, you must learn to calm down. Thomas left after that. Before he got off, he turned back to look at Nicole one last time. It was no longer the look of someone who had looked down on her, but of someone who had just learned to truly respect her. Rebecca stood beside him and said softly, You forgave him. Really? Nicole nodded. Not because he deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry my anger onto the next flight. When the last passenger left, the cabin was empty. Only the wind blew through the cracks in the door, and the dim lights in the cockpit remained on. Nicole turned back and looked at the dashboard, where the red warning light had once been, but was now silent. She reached out and gently touched the cold panel, whispering, We did it. David Jenkins, the last one left, stepped forward. You know, he said, the people at air traffic control are calling you the Silent Sky Captain. Nicole chuckled. They're right. In the sky, silence is power. Outside, Atlanta was dark. The runway lights cast an endless golden glow. Nicole put her captain's cap back on and stepped off the plane. Her shadow stretched long against the cold concrete, merging with the lights, small but majestic. That night, Nicole Williams returned to her hotel room in silence. On the table was the captain's cap she always carried with her, the last relic of her father, Robert Williams. She placed it neatly, poured a glass of water, then sat down by the window. Outside, the Atlanta sky was black, but between the tall buildings, the lights from the runway were still on, blinking like a whisper. You did it. 3 weeks later, the story of Skyway Flight 447 spread throughout the major newspapers, not with sensationalism, but with surprise and admiration. 15-year-old girl saves more than 200 lives. The headline ran in the New York Times. CNN called her the calm captain. Aviation Today magazine published a commentary. Nicole Williams' story will be included in training syllabuses for young pilots, not because of her flying skills, but because of her composure and character. At Skyway Airline's headquarters, the Aviation Safety Council invited Nicole to a special press conference. In front of them were dozens of cameras, spotlights, and rows of student pilots, flight attendants, and aviation engineers, people who had only heard the name Chief Pilot Williams from the press, now got to meet her in person. Nicole stepped onto the podium, petite in her fitted navy blue uniform, her captain's cap in hand. Below, no one said anything. There was only the clicking of cameras and the sound of people's hearts beating in unison. She did not read a speech. There was no paper in her hand. Only her voice was even, clear, and sincere. I don't think I'm a hero. I just did what I was taught as a child to stay calm and believe in what's right. I didn't fight anyone. I just tried to get everyone home. At that moment, the atmosphere in the auditorium seemed to melt away. The sentence was short, but it made everyone bow their heads, because there was not a trace of arrogance in it, only simple truth. In the back row, Thomas Richardson sat silently. His uniform was pressed, his name tag fresh. He looked up at the stage, his eyes watery but strangely bright. When the meeting ended, he walked up to Nicole. There was no fear or shame, but genuine gratitude. "Chief Williams," he said, his voice low, "I have been invited to be an instructor in the Diversity in Aviation program. They want me to tell my story, and I will." Nicole smiled and nodded. "Yes, tell it, Thomas, because more people need to hear it than ever." He smiled softly. His eyes filled with relief. "I would tell them that. Prejudice can kill an airplane, and the souls on it. But if just one person is calm, it can be saved." Nicole put her hand on his shoulder. "Light as the wind. You have learned what many people spend a lifetime understanding. I believe my father would be proud if he heard you say so." A month later, Flight 447 became a model scenario in the Federal Aviation Administration FAA training curriculum. Students learned crisis behavior analysis, mid-tropospheric maneuvering, and, more importantly, pilot psychology in a biased environment. They played Nicole's cockpit voice recording. Her voice was young, but her words were steady, strangely calm. No one believed the voice belonged to a teenager. A lecturer said she not only saved the plane, she saved humanity's faith in times of despair. And then he projected onto the screen the quote engraved on the Academy's new wall: "Courage, skill, and respect know no age, no color, no gender. Chief Pilot Nicole Williams, Skyway Airlines." Elsewhere, Thomas Richardson began his new job teaching flight attendant training. He opened his lecture with a photo of Nicole in the cockpit, holding the controls, the warning lights reflecting off her calm face. "I used to despise someone like this," he told the class, his voice slow and hoarse, "but she saved my life. And I tell it today not to apologize, but to remind us power is not about position, but about how you behave when challenged." The whole room was silent. A young student stood up and asked, "So are you still afraid of being wrong?" Thomas smiled. "No, I am more afraid of silence. Silence in the face of injustice. As for Nicole, she continued her work in aviation safety training and research. Despite her young age, she was awarded the FOA's Special Medal for outstanding calm under pressure. When she received the medal, she said only one sentence: "I don't want to be remembered for the storm, but for the calm that followed." One morning, a few months later, Nicole arrived at the airport early. The early morning sunlight bathed the runway in a soft, peaceful yellow. She stood alone, holding her captain's cap. In the sky, another plane took off, leaving a trail of white smoke. She raised her head to look, her eyes calm and proud. In that moment, it seemed as if her father, Robert Williams, appeared beside her, in his old Navy uniform, nodding and smiling. Nicole said softly, her voice only audible to the wind. "Courage, skill, and respect know no age, no color, no gender." Then she put on her hat, adjusted it, and walked straight toward the departure gate where a new flight was waiting. The story ends, but the echoes remain, not because a young woman landed safely, but because she made the world ask again. How often do we judge someone by how they appear, instead of how they act in life? Sometimes what gets us lost is not ignorance, but prejudice, the belief that we know everything with just one look. The story of Skyway Flight 447 reminds us that talent, courage, and dignity have no color, gender, or age. Nicole Williams, a 15-year-old girl, did not choose to respond to insults with anger, but with wisdom and right action. It was her calmness that saved more than 200 lives, and saved a soul lost in prejudice. Thomas Richardson. This is a lesson not only for the aviation industry, but for everyone in life. When you are looked down upon, don't rush to prove it with words. Let your composure and results speak for you. When you are wrong, don't be afraid to admit your mistakes, because making amends is also a form of courage. And when faced with differences, choose respect, because sometimes the person you look down on is the one who holds your destiny. If you believe that the world can be a better place when people learn to listen and understand each other, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help us spread stories about morality, justice, and humanity in life. Because each of your likes is not just a click, but an endorsement of a way of living with kindness, the way Nicole Williams chose. Amid the stormy skies, silent but powerful.